So in a lot of sports, bans were brought in to stop women from participating. The football ban is probably the most obvious one that many people will have heard about. So in 1921, the FA in England brought in a ban to stop women from playing. They said women cannot play on any of our facilities, from any member of our association's facilities. And they also cannot have any of our qualified referees. So that creates a huge problem for women's football. In Scotland, we don't do that. What we have is something a bit more dodgy. The SFA in the 1940s is bringing a formal ban. What's interesting is that ban, which is in place from the 40s, stays in place until the 1970s. So in 1970-71, UEFA write to all of the associations and they say to them, are women playing football in your countries? And secondly, would you be willing to lift any kind of obstacles that are in the way and support the growth of the women's game? So out of the 32 member states, 31 write back and say, yes, it's growing, yes, we're willing to lift the barriers and support the women's game. The only country that says no is Scotland.
Hello, Fiona Skillen, episode 14, Caledonian. Welcome, and thanks very much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me on. That's great.
No worries. I've never spoke to a historian before, I don't think, so this is going to be a real pleasure for me.
Absolutely.
I'm excited about this.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, just with your sort of background, you're obviously a professor here, history and working in the social sciences department at Cali. Yeah. Maybe if you could sort of tell us, you know, what perked your interest in history initially and what you choose this.
So, well, I've always been passionate about history since as far back as I can remember. I loved going to museums and reading history books and watching TV shows about history and so on. So history has always been a passion. The sport element came a bit later. So I'm a historian of sport, and I particularly specialise in the history of women's sport. So quite a niche. And that's something that came much later. I was brought up in a family of golfers. So my dad was a golfer, my uncles were all golfers. And so when I started playing, I was about 4 or 5 and played all the way through till I was about 16, 17. And I was very aware of the sexism in golf, to the point where at the golf club where my family played, they had this big lounge room, and 2/3 of that room were for the gents members, and the other third was a mixed lounge where anyone could go. And there was a line painted on the floor, and if you were a woman, you weren't allowed to go over the line. And so I remember as very vividly being about 4 or 5, tiptoeing along this line, and my dad getting really cranky and saying, don't go over the line, don't go over the line. And I'm like, why can't I go over the line? Because you're a girl. And so that immediately to me was just like, that's insane, that's madness. And so various other things happened when I was playing golf that made me realise that because of my gender, I was being treated differently. And so that kind of sparked an interest. So when I was doing my undergraduate degree, and I was looking for something to research that I was interested in, sport seemed a really obvious thing to kind of look at. So what are the origins of this? Where does this sexism and misogyny in sport come from that I had experienced? And what was that like for women who were trying to first break into those areas? And so that's how I ended up studying what I study.
I know, fascinating. Is that where are you going to name this golf club or give us a region? Because I feel like there was a one in Edinburgh in the Lothians, and it was only in the past sort of 10, 20 years where they sort of changed the rules.
So I won't name the club specifically, but it is in Lanarkshire. That's all I'll say. It's in Lanarkshire, so just outside Glasgow. And things have changed. Absolutely, things have changed. And even in my time playing there, things changed, and women got the opportunity to have equal membership. But I think even when you are given equal membership or equal opportunities, it takes a while for all the other stuff around that to change, the attitudes to change. And so I think sexism is still a significant problem in sport generally for women.
I know, absolutely. Maybe we touch on that sort of example specifically though. So
absolutely.
Like presumably the men, the sort of the committee, whoever it was that was running the club, thought that it was somehow going to diminish the sort of, I don't know, the way the golf club was run or membership or whatever. So since they changed the rules, like, what's your perception been in terms of how the club's run? Is it busier? Like, how would you say it's changed for the better?
I don't play any longer, but still have family members that play there, and the club does seem to be doing really well. And in the context of golf clubs are declining, we're looking across Scotland, we can see that golf club membership is declining. It is generally male, post-retirement age. That's the bulk of the population that play golf. And historically, that's kind of always been the case. And so that then gives you a problem in terms of keeping your golf club going if you've not got the new blood coming through. But the club that I played at does seem to be bucking that trend, does seem to have quite a thriving ladies section. They use the term ladies, not me, I should say that. They have a thriving ladies section and a thriving junior section. But it is absolutely, it's a challenge. And I think part of that is because golf it's not a quick sport to play. You can't just go and do it for half an hour. You have to commit at least 3 hours of your time to go and play 9 holes of golf. It's a slog. It takes time. So time is a factor in a culture where we are, time short always. I think there are lots of very prescribed rules and regulations around golf about when you can play, what you can wear to play, how you play, and the etiquette, and a lot of that is quite mysterious if you're not from that world. If you don't come from a background where people play golf in your immediate family circle or friendship circle, that can be enough to put you off, saying, well, I'm not going to try that because I don't want to make a fool of myself because I don't understand what the rules and the regulations are. So I think, and then over and above all of that, there is the perception of it being quite a male dominated sport, which is changing, but it's taking time. So I think there's lots of reasons why golf is not thriving, and not just in Scotland, it's across the world. There are challenges around that.
Yeah, you mentioned the sort of perception then, like amongst the sort of men there.
Yeah.
So like, what do you think it is that's been driving that, like historically, like this barrier to membership, I suppose? So
I think historically, I think it's because men have always had the kind of power in golf clubs. They are full members, so therefore they have all the rights to make changes, to make decisions. And when women were let in, they were let in as they weren't full members. So basically, although they were members, they were a subcategory of that. So therefore, they had no place on the committees. They had no voice in terms of challenging things or changing things. So they weren't empowered to do that until we got equalities legislation that meant that golf clubs and other institutions that were dominated by men or exclusive to men had to open up those opportunities to women. So historically, women just haven't had a voice in those spaces, and they've been deemed as being kind of bastions of masculinity. It's where men go to hang out. It's their space. It's a bit like football as well. We associate that as being a male safe space. We associate it as being a homosocial area where men go to mix with one another and have a laugh and spend their downtime. And we associate other activities with women. Perhaps women don't need sport for those sort of social experiences. We'll happily chat in the garden or go to the bar and have a glass of wine and have a chat. We don't necessarily need to have the excuse of playing a sport for us to get together socially.
Aye, no, that's interesting. You mentioned the sort of origins of women like playing sport. Then can you maybe go back to a bit of that?
Absolutely, yeah. So, women have played sport for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But women's organised sport, really the origins of much of that is the Victorian period. That's where we really start to see women formally taking up sports.
What's the timeline for that? Because I'm not as much a history buff as you.
Okay,
just conscious people out there.
The Victorian period is kind of the end of the 19th century. So we're talking kind of 1850s up to the 1900s. That's the kind of real boom time when we see a lot of organisations being set up by women for women to play sports. The reason they're set up by women for women is because often there are similar organisations for men's sport, but the women are not allowed to join. And so they end up having to set up their own organisation. So we see that in tennis, we see it in golf, we see it in hockey. that women are setting up their own organisations, mountain climbing. So, women are pushing the boundaries and playing lots of different sports and taking part in lots of different physical activities. So there's this kind of myth, I think, around the idea that women aren't really interested or didn't really take up sport until the 1960s or 70s. But actually that's nonsense. If we think about football, for example, a passion of yours, I know, the first recording of women playing football is in 1628. So that was a minister who was very annoyed that his parishioners were not adhering to the Sabbath. So they were having fun and doing things that he didn't think they should be doing on a Sunday. And one of the things that he notes is that women were playing football. And so because of this man being really annoyed at women playing sport, we have this record. So we know that they were doing it. I mean, it's not the kind of football we recognise now of association rules. It's more like folk football. It's more informal. But nonetheless, women are playing. So again, this idea that women didn't play football to the 1990s, absolute nonsense. 1628, and that is in Scotland. And as far as I'm aware, that's the earliest recording in the whole of Europe of women playing football.
Very interesting. On that subject, right, slightly different, but I was want to ask you this, let's may as well go there. Like, why is it that there seems to be a debate now about who invented football, or modern day football as we know? Can we just put it to bed it was Scotland, right? And then
Scotland,
we move on?
Absolutely Scotland. So if this is something that you're interested in, if the listeners are interested in finding out more, have a Google of a group called the Hampden Collection. And they are a group of volunteers, historians, who are researching the history of Scottish football. And what they are trying to demonstrate is that actually lots of the features of modern football have their origins in Scotland. And one of the big things around that is the Scotch professors. So this idea that football is a passing game, where we pass the ball, we work as a team to try and score. And they argue, and they have lots of evidence to prove this, that is a Scottish invention. That's the Scottish way of playing football, where before it was an individual running with the ball and trying to score the ball. They would never pass to other people. They would only be passing forward for them to run onto the ball themselves. And so part of the Scotch professors' argument is about this style of play and the idea that these guys from Scotland who played this form of football regularly, then went out across the empire and shared that, and then that took off from there. So there's great stories of people in Brazil and Argentina and Australia starting to play the Scottish passing football game.
I had read this briefly the other week there, so it looks as though it's the sort of semantics, the detail then that's getting argued about then, so maybe I'm going to develop this sort of sport where maybe they, like you say, it was individualistic. They maybe running for the sort of the defence to the sort of the forward to score. And it was maybe more violent, but we've invented. So it wasn't the Spanish invented tiki taka, it was Scotland.
So there's lots of elements. I mean, Scotland also argue that they invented Bovril, for example. So there's lots of elements of football that Scotland can lay claim to. In the same way that there's also lots of things about football that other nations can lay claim to. I mean, China, for example, they might claim that they invented football because there are records from thousands of years ago of people playing a game that looks a bit like football. The Dutch as well. So there's lots of different things, but I think the takeaway from it is that Scotland contributed to the modern game. We don't talk about that and we don't celebrate that enough, and really we absolutely should do that. So if you want to find out more, look at the Hampden Collection. Also look at the Football Square Mile, which is a new project that they've just launched, which is the biggest open-air museum in the world to football. And it's got, I think it's 25 sites around Glasgow that you can walk around and you use your phone. And they've got QR codes and you click on it and it takes you to a website that tells you all about why these different venues in Glasgow, how they link to the history of football in Scotland. So it's a fantastic thing to have a look at and to be part of. So I contribute a little tiny bit to that group, looking at the history of women's football. So it's a great group of people and they do fantastic work.
No, that sounds class. So sorry, we just went away in a wee tangent there, but I couldn't resist it. So you mentioned the sort of origins of sort of women playing sport then, and then this account, obviously the priest or the vicar, getting a bit annoyed and documenting this. Like, is there any accounts, I suppose, for those early days that you've researched, that you can remember women who were particularly significant, and some of the challenges they faced, and maybe how they fought that and won,
absolutely.
basically.
So there's a number of different stories I could tell you. Really, once we get into that Victorian era, so we're talking around about the 1880s and 1890s, that's where we start to see women playing football along association lines. So a bit more like the modern game that we now recognise. So formal rules and regulations. And we have women playing that all over Scotland. We have one team in particular, the British Ladies Football Club, which originates down in London, Crouch End, I think. And they come up and they play in Scotland, and they play all over. And there's a big outcry because people are shocked. This is not something that women should be doing. They should be, very restrained. They shouldn't be displaying their bodies in public. They shouldn't be partaking in these really masculine sports, really competitive sports. There's lots of myths as well at this time about what women's bodies are capable of as well. So there's this idea that really they're not suited to sport, that they have a limited amount of energy, that they're going to wear themselves out by playing sport, and really they need to preserve that energy in order to be looking after the home, bringing up children and so forth. There's also misunderstandings around their physiology. So how do their bodies work? And this belief that by playing certain sports, they're going to damage their reproductive systems, which obviously in this era, that's a woman's main role, is simply to marry and have children and to raise those children. So if she's choosing to do something that could potentially disrupt that process, that's really controversial. So there's a lot of myths around that. There's also myths around psychology of women as well, that playing sports that are competitive and masculine would make a woman start to think like a man. And so therefore she wouldn't be suited to marriage, because who would want to marry a woman that thinks like a man? But also more worrying, there are kind of undercurrents of sort of lesbianism, this idea that women will become lesbians if they play sport. So again, all these things that we now know from research are absolute nonsense, but the Victorians really held quite firmly to these beliefs, and so it became very controversial for women to play football and to play other really physically demanding sports. But if we fast forward into the 20th century, the First World War was a really important time for women's football, and lots of teams sprung up across Scotland, and women were playing, usually around factories and sites of production for war work. And those teams did really amazing things during the war to raise money for charity. And so people didn't see it as controversial because the men were away fighting, so the men weren't really playing football. So in that sense, it was okay for women to step into that void that had been left. And they were doing it to raise money for charity. So they weren't doing it for themselves. They weren't being selfish. They weren't promoting themselves. They were doing it for charity. And so again, that was less controversial. So that was allowed. But the team I'd like to tell you about that I think are really interesting are a team called Rutherglen Ladies. So some of your listeners might know of the Dick Kerr Ladies. They're kind of the most famous historical women's football team. And they played in England. But we have an equivalent. It's not quite on the same scale as Dick Kerr's. Dick Kerr ran for 60 odd years, and they toured all over the UK. They toured to France. They toured to the United States. Ours isn't quite on that scale, but we have the Rutherglen Ladies who played for about 20 years, almost 20 years. And they played all over Scotland, and they toured to Ireland, which again, if we're thinking about the 1920s, how difficult that is to get to Ireland, that's a really significant thing that they did. So they played all over. They had huge crowds. We're talking 5,000 to 10,000 people coming to watch them. So not insignificant and comparable to the best teams that we currently have in the women's championship and leagues. So really significant. And one of the players that was a kind of standout, that was often singled out by the press in that era, was a woman called Sadie Smith. And she was really skilled, to the point where often when you read reports of women's football in the 1920s and 30s, they're a bit kind of tongue-in-cheek. They like to make fun of the women. They don't understand the offside rule and all those sorts of things. But Sadie Smith was different. She was so talented that the men didn't criticise her. They praised her skills. And in fact, they said that she was like Alan Morton, who at that time, he was the premier player for Rangers, and he was also played for Scotland internationalists. So that's a really big name for someone to be getting compared to. So she was fantastic. And what we discovered, I did this piece of research around Rutherglen Ladies with my colleague Steve Bolton, and we've just done an exhibition about it. It was at the National Football Museum for almost a year, and it's now touring around Scotland, so you can catch it in different places. But what we discovered in the course of doing that research was that Sadie has a very famous granddaughter. Her granddaughter is the singer-songwriter Eddie Reader. And so in the course of finding this story out, we were able to make contact with Eddie and chat to her about this story. And it was amazing because the family didn't know that she had been a footballer and that she'd had this career and that she'd had all this press acclaim. And Eddie said, the only thing that I can think of that kind of relates to this is that my uncle was playing football in the back court of the tenement when he was quite young. And this guy leant over the fence and said to him, "My son, you're good, but you're not as good as your ma." And nobody in the family really understood what he was talking about. And Sadie didn't enlighten them about this. And she died quite young. I think she was in her late 50s when she died. And so nobody knew this. So we were able to kind of piece together this story. And then we worked with Eddie on a documentary for the BBC about tracing this story and uncovering Sadie's story. And that was fantastic. That was just an amazing experience and amazing to find this story and be able to celebrate this woman in a way that she hadn't been during her lifetime, that she had this amazing career, had all this acclaim, and then got married and put all of that behind her, went on to have a big family, and that was her focus, and she never ever talked about it.
Aye, well, that's a brilliant story. Was there ever any sort of investigation or speculation into maybe why she sort of concealed this great career? Like, or is that a trend that you've seen from women through the sort of Victorian era into the 20th century?
Absolutely. I think there's two things, and we don't know with Sadie specifically, but I think for some women it's probably a case of that they might have been ashamed of it because it was still seen as something controversial, particularly football, to be a footballer. But I think also if you think about, this young working class girl who, because of her talent in football, was given all of these amazing experiences. She got to play against all these, other teams. She got to travel all over Scotland. She got to travel to Ireland. She had all these fantastic adventures that you couldn't even dream of, I don't think, as a young woman from her background in that time. And the fun she must have had and the things she must have seen. And so to then be able to you settle down and you get married and you have kids and you close the door on that, maybe that's because that's painful, because your world has suddenly become a heck of a lot smaller. You're now in a room and kitchen with 3 kids or whatever. So maybe it's too painful to remember all of that stuff and talk about all of that stuff. Or maybe it's just old-fashioned modesty. We're kind of taught not to be, in Scotland, we're not particularly bumptious. We're not particularly good at bigging ourselves up. We're very good at bringing people down to size. So maybe there's an element of that as well. We'll never know because we're not able to ask Sadie herself. But it's amazing as a historian to have the opportunity, and it happens a lot in the research that I do, to uncover or to rediscover stories that have been hidden away for various reasons, and to be able to bring them to light and talk about them with the public, or do, like this kind of thing, do podcasts, do radio shows, do documentaries, whatever it might be, to write books, to celebrate those women that were the pioneers, that were really pushing the boundaries to get active and to become part of these sports.
Aye, no, that's an absolutely brilliant story. Amazing. Really glad you told me that. Maybe just to go back to that sort of period in the Victorian period before, like you mentioned, obviously, in the First World War, these women were obviously playing together and the men were sort of away, fighting war and stuff like that. But was there ever any accounts of like men helping women? Was there any sort of, there must have been allies presumably?
Absolutely, yeah, there were allies. So for example, the Rutherglen Ladies, it was a man that was the manager, J.H. Kelly, and his whole family became involved in running the team, and they all had different roles. So some of them were taking the gate money, some of them were cooking, some of them were the physio, we wouldn't call them the physio, but they were the trainer, all these sorts of different roles. So they were definitely allies in women's sport. I wouldn't say huge numbers. The majority of people were against women participating in sport. particularly some sports. You know, some were fine, so things like croquet, swimming, ice skating, those sorts of things were less controversial because they were seen as being quite gentle, quite feminine, so they weren't really challenging the norms of the day. But other sports that were seen as more problematic, like rugby, like football, like hockey, those sports were a harder sell. And so there were some people, absolutely, some men that were allies and that supported the development of these sports, promoted them, wrote about them, absolutely.
No, that's good to hear. Obviously, like you're saying, there wasn't the majority of men, unfortunately, just probably the way society was structured at that time. So I don't know how much Joe Public, you know, a certain member of society would know about some of these barriers that women have had to face to get equal access to sport and pursue these sort of fitness opportunities. So could you maybe talk about some of that?
Absolutely. So obviously there are the kind of informal barriers. So just the kind of, you're a girl, you can't do that kind of stuff that isn't really necessarily based on any hard facts or evidence. It's just a perception. It's just an idea that you shouldn't do things because you are, you know, put in a certain pigeonhole. So there are those kind of non-tangible barriers, but then there are very specific barriers. So in a lot of sports, bans were brought in to stop women from participating. So we can see that in lots of different sports. You know, we see it in dirt bike racing in the 1930s. They brought in a ban. We see it in skating, roller skating. We see it in some athletics. We can see, for example, women aren't participating in the marathon until into the 80s. Again, to do with ideas about what women are physically capable of. So some organisations brought in bans because they thought they were protecting women from themselves, you know, that they're just not capable, so let's stop them from doing it and hurting themselves. The football ban is probably the most obvious one that many people will have heard about. So in 1921, the FA in England brought in a ban to stop women from playing. Now, what they did was, they didn't say women can't play. They said women cannot play on any of our facilities, from any member of our association's facilities. And they also cannot have any of our qualified referees, participating in the game. So really they're cutting the game off at its knees, because where do you play? Who's going to officiate, because only men are qualified? Who's going to officiate at these games? So immediately you are undermining the game, and you are taking away any kind of credibility that it has as well. So that creates a huge problem for women's football. In Scotland, we don't do that. What we have is something a bit more dodgy, insidious. The SFA don't bring in a formal ban until, they try earlier on in the century, but it doesn't have much effect. But in the 1940s, they bring in a formal ban. But in between times, they have this kind of, we don't encourage it, we don't think we should support it, and they put pressure on clubs not to host women's matches. And so that's really problematic. So although it's not a formal ban, women in Scotland are still finding it difficult to get access to facilities, to have people to come and officiate and so forth. What's interesting is that ban, which is in place from the 40s, stays in place until the 1970s. So in 1970-71, UEFA write to all of the associations and they say to them, are women playing football in your countries? So these sorts of bans happen all across Europe. So they write to all the associations and they say, firstly, are women playing football in your country? And secondly, would you be willing to lift any kind of obstacles that are in the way and support the growth of the women's game? So out of the 32 member states, 31 write back and say, yes, it's growing. Yes, we're willing to lift the barriers and support the women's game. The only country that says no is Scotland. So we have this really odd situation where all the bans are lifted across Europe, apart from Scotland, who hang on by their fingernails until 1974. And in 1974, despite lots of protests from women in Scotland going to the SFA and demanding changes, they hang on until 74. And I think the reason that changes in 74 is because they bring in the Equalities Act in Westminster, which basically means that you cannot discriminate against somebody having access to facilities on the basis of their sex. And so the SFA's hand is kind of forced to make them recognise the women's game. Now, they don't go out of their way after that point to say, here, have lots of money, here, we'll help you develop the game. They certainly don't. But that ban is then lifted, which makes life slightly easier for women's football to develop. But I think it's just fascinating because some people don't realise those bans are in place, or if they do, what that actually means realistically for the growth and development of the sport. What I found really interesting in the research is the first international match happens in 1972 between England and Scotland. So obviously the Scottish team are still banned. So they have to go to a municipal pitch in Greenock to hold this big international match. And the English team, they've been recognised, they have a little bit of Sports Council funding, so they're in a slightly better position. They have, outfits to wear, a proper kind of, not quite a uniform, but almost a uniform to wear, and a strip to wear, and they've done some training and stuff. The Scotland team have had to take out a provident loan in order to, get everything together for the game. Somebody has bought the strips and they've had to get their mum to sew the numbers on the back. It's all very kind of home knitted. It's all very kind of kitchen table stuff because these women are so passionate and they want to do it. And they do, but the women don't get recognition for it. And again, I can talk more about that, about what happens. The story of those women is fascinating as well. But they don't get the recognition that they deserve for the effort that they put in to get international women's football off the ground in Scotland.
Let's talk about that definitely, but just park it briefly.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm just interested in timeline. You mentioned this, obviously the Second World War. Again, men are probably they're away fighting. Women have been tasked, to go and work in the factories and that. So they obviously take up this mantle, whatever, producing the weapons and all that sort of stuff. But I think I'd read sort of recently that they were then involved with the sport again. So the men were playing football maybe at lunchtime or after work. Yeah. So how does it work once the men come back from war? Like, why are the women? They must presumably go, well, we quite enjoy this. This is a hobby, it's a passion, as we want to continue this. Like, what barriers? Like, why does that come about again? Effectively, a sort of barrier to entry. And
so the Second World War is kind of odd in that women's football doesn't take off in the same way during the Second World War as it does in the First, and we don't quite know why. But during the First World War, it's exactly as you described. The men go off to war. The women are then in the factories doing the men's jobs. And so it's a natural thing that they're then going to do other things that the men do. So have a kickabout in their lunch hour. Football is great. It's a flexible sport that can be played in lots of different spaces. You don't need specialist equipment. It's flexible in terms of how long you play for. You don't need a huge amount of skill to have a kickabout. And so there's this idea that they did it because it was accessible. Some people think they were encouraged to do it by the employers because it got them fit, because obviously they're doing really strenuous manual labour. So the employers want them to be stronger. So encouraging them to play sports is one way of doing that. There's also an argument that it stops them gossiping and unionising, and it's causing trouble for the employers as well. So again, this notion of they're being encouraged to play the sport for a certain reason, and then ultimately this notion that they're doing it in order to raise money for charity. So at the end of the war, to come back to your question, at the end of the war, essentially what happens is the government kind of pat them on the head and say, right, thanks very much, love, back to what you were doing before. And that had always been the agreement, that this was a temporary situation, that the women were filling in for the men. And when the men came back from the front, they would be going back into their jobs and the women would be leaving those jobs. So the women were very much forced out of those occupations, and we have what they sometimes call the backlash theory. So historians call it the backlash theory, which is basically that during the war anything goes because the men are away, so society is in flux, lots of things are changing, so it's perfectly okay for women to do things that are men's roles. But when the men come back, everybody wants to go back to basics. Let's go back to where we were before. So therefore, women in the home looking after the children, the men in the workforce being the male breadwinners, and all the stuff that goes with that. So the idea that women should only be doing genteel sports, that they should only be doing feminine leisure activities. So there's a backlash against women, which I think is why the ban comes in 1921 in England. It's interesting when you read the ban in the minute books, it says it's an unsuitable game for women. And the reason it's unsuitable is twofold. One, physically, they think it's unsuitable, it's going to damage their organs, so we're back to that Victorian argument. And secondly, somewhat ironically, they say that the women's game is corrupt. although there's very little evidence to back that up. So that's in England. But some women did want to continue playing, and so we do see a number of teams developing and continuing during that period between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War, and that's when Rutherglen Ladies emerge and become, this superstar team.
Aye, no, excellent. There was another one I had seen, Kathrine Switzer. Have you heard of her?
Yes, Kathrine Switzer. Yeah, marathon runner.
Yeah, just when you mentioned sort of marathons earlier, I thought that was a kind of fascinating story as well.
She's brilliant, and she is a kind of suffragette of women's sport. She, for those of you that don't know, she was a marathon runner, and in the I can't remember the exact date, but it was in the 1970s. The marathon in Boston, it was men only.
I think it was earlier.
Was it earlier?
Well, the account I've read says it was 1967.
Was it 67? Okay. Yeah. So it's men only in the Boston Marathon, and Kathrine decided that there was absolutely no reason why that was the case, that women should be allowed. And so she registered using her initials, so it wasn't really obvious that the K stood for Kathrine. And she turned up and she joined the marathon and she ran. But the officials were so thrown by this, they didn't know what to do about it. And there was this one guy who was so incensed about it, he actually attacked her. He rugby tackled her to the ground, and her boyfriend, who was running with her, kind of lifted the guy off, and Kathrine was able to get up and carry on and continue to complete the marathon. So that grabbed headlines all over, because it wasn't the first time a woman had run a marathon. There were others, but this was the first time it had been reported in the media and got such media coverage, and it then started people asking questions about, well, why are women not allowed to run the marathon? Why are they being held back from that? By that point, we'd started to understand women's biology and know that actually there isn't a physical reason why they shouldn't be allowed to run those kind of distances as well.
I know, brilliant story. It was actually a Scottish guy, apparently, who was one of the race conveners. So we've got this terrible history, unfortunately.
We do.
Denying women entry in sport. But there's actually a good, Sky Sports did a good article about it if anybody wants to research it. And then 5 years later, they're sort of pictured together, and she's a good sport, pardon the pun, and she's sort of cuddling them and saying, let's let bygones be bygones here. But it's fascinating to me, like the way obviously you're describing, Scotland, the Scottish sort of women's team being banned and then playing England at this game, which hopefully we'll go on to. And then this is only 2 generations ago, really.
Absolutely.
Where there's this perception, that women shouldn't be undertaking these physical activities. It's I don't know if this is a good word, but it's very perplexing and mental to me to think that this was a thing.
It absolutely is, and I think that's why. That's why I do what I do, because I think these stories need to be told and discussed and talked about. And I hope that, as well as giving these women whose stories have been forgotten or overlooked or suppressed in some cases, the credit that they deserve, I also hope that they are inspiring to young girls and women coming through as well, to kind of see, well, yes, I'm still facing adversity. There are still many barriers on women's participation to sport. But also, let's look back and see how bad things were and how far things have come in, a couple of decades, really. Because I think even in the last 5 to 10 years, women's sport, and in particular women's football, has developed so much. And there's still a lot of things that we're not getting right yet, but it has developed so much from where it was to where it is now.
Let's talk about that then, because I'm interested in that. Like, as I mentioned the word sort of ally earlier, so like, where are we now, and how can people like me, just a random guy, Joe Public, how can we be like more allied and help to remove these barriers?
That's a really good question. So I think being aware of the history is helpful, because often when I teach a class at Cali about the history of women's sport, and often I hear students saying, but women's football's not as good as men's, right? So there's that argument. And you say, well, actually, it's different to men's. Women's style of play is different. Women's physicality is different. But also, if you really want to take it back into the history, the women's game hasn't had the development that the men's game has. It hasn't had the investment. It still doesn't have really just starting to get professionalisation in Scotland of the women's game and clear pathways for women who want to pursue careers in football. So again, it's like comparing apples with pears. They're not the same thing. And so I think being more open to what the sports are. I think being supportive of them for what they are in their own entity. I think shutting down people who are criticising it for no good reason. I think there are lots of good reasons to criticise sport and particular events and whatever, individuals. But when it's just sexism for the sense of, being sexist, absolutely wade in and shut that down. Because, I spend a lot of my time on Twitter, keyboard warriors fighting back against them, and also pointing things out. So when they say things like, oh, the men have qualified for such and such a competition, and this is good. It's the first time Scotland have qualified for 25 years or whatever. Like, actually, the women did that 5 years ago or whatever. So it's just kind of pointing out those obvious things, things that are obvious to me, to say, but actually, women are part of this picture too, and a very valid part of that picture. And it's only by doing that, and us all starting to do that, that we will see change. And therefore, that will make places better for young women and girls coming through as well, and other groups as well, because this isn't just about women and men are the obvious kind of categories here, but there are lots of other identities and groups that are underrepresented and face a really difficult time in sport, and so being able to open up those conversations will then, I hope, make it more equitable for everybody.
My kind of view is we're all humans effectively, and I wouldn't bar anybody who wants to participate in sport. I think that competition is good, and I think I don't mind separating people based on ability, but based on anything else is discriminatory in my opinion, and it should be stopped.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the reasons I'm sort of interested in this, I had Claire Docker in actually, if anybody's sort of interested in she plays for MA United, she's a brilliant sort of women's player, but my sister was a fantastic football player as well, and she played with the boys when she was younger, and she was better than probably 70% of the boys at her age group at her school. And she played in the sort of the boys team at sort of primary school level, but there wasn't any teams locally. No. So I sort of often speculate, what would have happened if my sister was born now, for example. She would probably be playing at a decent level, but it was not available at that sort of point, and she never pursued it probably because of that, and that's a shame.
Absolutely, but I think again that shows in that short period of time how much things have changed. Because now there are more opportunities for girls to play, there are more obvious pathways for them to play. A lot more of the big men's clubs now have women's teams. They're investing in those, and they're investing in the development of young players as well to kind of feed through into the more senior teams. So things are changing, which is fantastic, and there are still opportunities for your sister. There are opportunities for her to get back into football. She might not be playing it, and it might be a bit late for her to be playing at an elite level, but there are lots of other kind of local groups for women to play football at all ages, or to just go along and try it as well.
Aye, well, I'll not speak for her. I'll not say anything. She's probably be listening to this. So maybe we go back to the Scotland game then. Yes. It sounds like you stopped and you were going to sort of tell us how that progressed. So
the Scotland game, it's wonderful, and the women that played there, so your listeners will probably be aware of Rose Reilly, I hope. She is probably the best footballer that Scotland has ever produced, and I say that without qualification of gender. I think she's up there with the best. So Rose was playing in that game. Edna Nellis, who again was on the same sort of level as Rose, really skillful, also went and had an international career in France and in Italy, but ultimately stepped back for personal reasons, stepped back from it, so didn't have the sustained career that Rose ultimately did. And then people like Elsie Cook, who Elsie is the kind of godmother, I think, of women's football in Scotland. She really drove forward the development of the game, got games up and organised when other people were struggling to do that, brought people together. She's still doing it now. She's bringing people together. She's got a Facebook page where she brings back old players, and they're all chatting and reminiscing about their various adventures. So that game back in 1972 was a real turning point in terms of it's the first international, it's really important. But the thing that I found really interesting is between 1972, that first game, and I think it's 1995, when the SFA kind of took women's football formally under its wing and it became part of the organisation. Between those two periods, anybody who played for Scotland, the women who played for Scotland, I should say, didn't get a cap. Right, which is unheard. Can you imagine that if that was the men's game and you didn't get a cap?
Well, it's brutal, obviously.
Absolutely, it's madness. So one of the changes that is currently happening is the SFA are working with myself and Dr. Karen Fraser from Stirling University and Andy Mitchell, who's an eminent historian of Scottish football. And what we're trying to do collectively is trace those women that played between 72 and 95. We're trying to map out the matches that count because, again, when they're not recognised formally, there are no formal records in SFA archives. So we're trying to kind of trace them through newspaper reports, through match programmes, through interviews with players and so forth to work out which matches were played along international regulation lines and who actually played. Because again, you can get a match programme, but we all know not everybody's going to turn up or not going to get subbed on or whatever. So again, we're needing to verify all of that. And then with the SFA, we're contacting those women and we're inviting them back to get awarded their caps posthumously. So far, I think we're up to 1983. So those events are held usually at the Women's International matches. As part of that, there's a ceremony where they are given their caps. And that's been amazing to be part of that process. So some of the women are delighted. Some of the women are really angry and just like too little, too late. Don't want to do that. Which you can understand. I mean, you know, they were overlooked, they were undermined for so long. And so what we've tried to say is you were due that respect, you were due that recognition, and it's wrong that it's taken that long, but it is now happening. So, you know, please come and be part of it. Please come and let us celebrate your success and your skill. And so they've been coming along and they get a nice meal and they have a ceremony and somebody high up from the SFA like Mike Mulroney will come along and there's a presentation and they get their cap and we take photographs. And obviously for some of the women it's too late because they've passed away, which is really sad. But what we try to do in that circumstance is contact the family of the player and get somebody to come along, a representative to come along to accept it on behalf of the family. And then ultimately what we hope to do is have something in the museum that is, you know, a list of the women who have played for Scotland that we can then add to as that continues, so that there is a point where people can go and look up and say, oh yeah, all these women have represented Scotland, and we can learn those names and learn those stories.
There could be a few more Eddie Reader situations out there, it seems like, where with Granny.
Absolutely. Yeah, so if anyone knows of any, if anyone out there listening has any connections that they think we should be looking into, then, you know, please do drop me an email, give me a Google and find my email address and let me know.
Fiona Skillen at Glasgow Caledonian University, they'll get you all right.
They will.
You mentioned Rose Reilly there as well, so I'll be honest, I was not aware of Rosie's story, and I was quite embarrassed actually about that because it was Tommy Sheridan was in and he had met her at some, you know, over 60s walking tournament. He told me about her. And I thought I need to Google, you know, Rose Reilly, and then what a fascinating story. I've actually made contact with Celtic. She's an ambassador there now, and I'm trying to get her on the podcast. So they're sort of saying that they're going to line that up for me, hopefully. And obviously, Celtic ladies have won the league this year, so
she'll be happy to come and chat about that. I mean, she's a real character. She's as you might imagine, someone who's faced so much adversity to do the thing that they want to do. She's passionate about opening up access and making it easier for other women who are coming behind her. But I mean, if you're interested in Rose's story, there's a great documentary, a BBC documentary about Rose Reilly, BBC Alba, and that tells the story. But I mean, essentially, she grew up in Stewarton. She played with, I think it was Stewarton boys. She got her hair cut so she looked like a boy, so she could play with the boys. And she called herself Ross so that she would blend in. And the legend goes that the Celtic scout came and saw her playing and wanted to sign her, and they had to kind of take him aside and say, you can't, because she's a girl. And then she ended up playing with the women's team, the Rutherglen Ladies. And then ultimately, there was no career in Scotland. There was nowhere to go for that. There was no professional options at that point, and that didn't come till very recently. And so she and Elsie and Edna went to see, I think it was Stan Shivis, who was a sports journalist at the Daily Record, and they said, come on, these girls have got talent, you know that, what can you do to help? And so he managed to get some money together and set up an opportunity for them to go and have a trial at Stade de Reims in France, and they were signed by half-time. and they played there, and then they ended up going to Italy and playing for various Italian teams. And Rose, she won so many competitions. At one point, she was playing on a Saturday in Italy and on a Sunday in France, and she won both of those leagues. I presume they were. Both of those, her teams won both of those leagues that year, and they had to change the rules to stop future players from
going cross-border
because of Rose. So, it's an amazing story. And she ended up playing for Italy. They offered her a national nationality in order to get her to play for Italy. She was so good. And by that point, she'd been banned in Scotland because she'd had a professional career and so forth. So, I mean, she's just, the things she's achieved are phenomenal. And then we have her back in Scotland now. She lived in Italy for many years, but has moved back to Scotland. And I think she's, you said she's an ambassador for Celtic, but she is also a great role model for women's sport and women's football. And she does a lot of work with young girls.
I know she seems like a good laugh as well in the bargain, which is also
she's
a theme
hilarious,
we like on Kelly Connor. So,
but also hard to interview. I will give you that tip because I interviewed her. So we had her. She's an honorary graduate at Cali, and we had her for a kind of evening with. And I was asked to interview her. And you just tee up the questions and off she goes, and it's kind of trying to sort of wave at her and say, right, we need to come back to another question because she just has so many amazing stories, and you don't really want to stop her, but you have to when you're on a timeline. So.
Oh, well, there's no time limits in Cali Corner, so no, that sounds, as I say, she's hopefully going to be on Celtic. I haven't contacted Celtic, so we'll see. Cool. What about, we'll just go up to the modern day then, Fiona, like, how you've mentioned obviously the progress in the last 20 years, like how do you think we're tracking, and like what should the dream for you in terms of women's participation in sport, in sport, whether it's football or golf or anything else?
So I think we're making huge progress, and I think if you'd asked me this question maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I would have been wildly optimistic, because at that point, coming off the back of the London Olympics, the Commonwealth Games, it seemed like a corner had been turned and everyone finally got that women's sport was important, and we were starting to get coverage, we were starting to get sponsorship. But then COVID happened, and suddenly women's sport was the first thing that got cut. When we were having discussions about which sports should go ahead, which sports, should we be mothballing, it was always the women's sports and activities. Now, I'm not stupid, I understand why that is, because economically that they're not as profitable yet because they're still establishing themselves. So I do understand there's a market force there, but I think it also shows why we value certain things, and it comes down to monetary values. So that made me a little bit more cynical about the growth and development and the kind of sustained growth and development of women's sport. But having said that, I think there's lots of reasons to be optimistic. If we stick with kind of football as the theme, we can see now that we have, I think it's 4 teams in Scotland that now have professional women playing. The whole team isn't professional, so we still have people who are doing kind of dual careers. But there are now options out there for women to make a career in football in Scotland, which is phenomenal. We have clear pathways with a lot of these big clubs actually investing in young women and girls training and development, which again is a real positive. I think what we probably need to do more of is invest in our sports fans and developing the fans around these sports. So again, if we look at football in England, huge numbers of people are supporting women's football in England. In Scotland, slightly less so. I was at the women's semi-final, Scottish Cup semi-final on Sunday, and there were 4,000 people there, which is great, but I would love that to be 10,000 next year. So how do we do that? How do we develop that? How do we get more people coming to games and interested? And I think if it's something that, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I'm not sure if that's for me, go and try it. It's really cheap, if not free, to go along. The atmosphere at women's football is very different to men's football. I go along with my kid. It's very friendly. It's very family friendly. There's a lot less swearing and shouting and aggression. In fact, the first time I went, there was a really nice pass somebody did, and everybody clapped. And I was sort of looking, going, what are they taking the piss? What's going on? This is really strange. But it wasn't. It was just that people are much more encouraging, and it's a very different atmosphere. And so I would really encourage you to go along and try it and experience it and support a club. That's another great way to be an ally, is to support a club.
Aye, no, definitely. That'll be my challenge then for the next year. I need to go along with my son and experience some games and take
Absolutely.
Cool, Fiona. We've done nearly about 52 minutes. So, is there anything that I've not asked you that you were wanting to cover off today?
No, it's been great. I really enjoyed chatting to you. I can't believe that time has flown by.
Aye, I know. No, I really appreciate you coming in, and I've learnt so much. So, thanks very much for coming in, and maybe get you again in the future.
Absolutely.
Fiona. Thank you.
you.
Cheers.